New Year to everyone, and thank you for taking some time to hear what we have to say about this practitioner's workbook. For some of you, you might have sat in on the presentation I did last month. This is just going to be a repeat of that, but you're welcome to stay along. Um, So as you can see, all your phones are muted. If you want to go into full screen mode, there's a little button that you can do, double-headed arrow, and that'll get you into full screen mode. At the end of the presentation, we'll go ahead and open up the lines as well as the chat box for questions. But if you have questions along the way, go ahead and do it in the chat box, and then Paige will interrupt me as it makes sense. This is being recorded, so it will be available for people to review at another point. All right, so where are we? So over the years, I've had, I don't know, I would say at least 20 people come up to me and ask, isn't there a book that we can read that describes the process of building a short-term load forecasting model? And I mean, the reality was there were econometric textbooks that would kind of do a deep dive on what regressions were. You could probably find academic material on, what a neural network is, and certainly support vector regression. And there have been many articles, many published journal articles on sort of modeling in terms of short-term forecasting, but very few of that material is specific to the specifications and the techniques that are used. And so what I thought when I finally started writing this, the audience that I was trying to write to was to someone who was new to this world or who had been doing forecasting before and just wanted a little bit deeper understanding of the techniques that were there, and also perhaps jog a little ideas about different explanatory variables that could be used for doing short-term modeling. So the book kind of walks through our approach, where our approach starts with looking at the data, and then it kind of talks about the various techniques that could be used, and then sort of at the end or in the middle of the book, there is sort of the quote-unquote recipe book, which is really just different model specifications. Although I will put a huge caveat, there really is no single model that can fit all situations. I have built, personally, probably built over 5,000 models for loads all over the world, and although there are some very common elements to it, almost all models have some sense of day of the week and maybe some weather, they all vary, and everything is a little bit different. And so having the ability to kind of look at the particular load and think about what explanatory variables make sense for that load is really sort of the art to the whole process. So the focus is on sort of the day ahead problem within day as well. So if you're talking about doing modeling or looking at forecasts for the next hour over, say, the next 10 days, that's really sort of the key aspect of the modeling that we're going to focus on. Now, if you're doing other type of modeling, like long-term hourly modeling in particular, there are some lessons here that you can use to sort of help you in that world as well. But for the primary purpose of the book is really sort of operational balance in the day, next day type forecasting. So the outline of the book, and by the way, the book is available free. You can just go onto our website, and I'll show you where you can go at the end. You can go online, fill out a little form, say who you are, and you can download the book. It's in PDF form. So feel free to go ahead and grab a copy of it. It's about a little over 200 pages. So if you're having a hard time sleeping, I'd highly recommend taking a look at it in the evenings. The outline of the book is we start with some data. So we found some sort of publicly available load data, one for a smaller size utility and the other one for a larger size utility. So we have those kind of variations in terms of what the load shapes look like in terms of scale, and also some weather sensitivity. We then talk about how we look at the load data, what are sort of our approach to looking at data, and then once you're looking at it, one of the core parts to all the modeling is you have to have clean data, because the objective functions the basis upon which we estimate model parameters are very sensitive to data outliers or errors. So you have to kind of clean the data ahead of time before you can just throw any technique at it. And that sort of data cleaning and philosophy would apply whether you're doing sort of standard regression stuff or similar day lookup, or if you're doing, sort of the more modern day stuff where, sort of unsupervised or supervised learning from the artificial intelligence world. You still need to have a clean set of data. So we talk about that. And then what we do is we introduce some forecasting approaches. So we talk about algorithms, and then univariate frameworks, and then multivariate frameworks. And ultimately, the ones that we use, our sort of bread and butter approach frameworks, are the regressions and neural networks. But I try to put them all into sort of context, so you can see where one technique or approach might work well for certain types of loads, where other ones might be better for, sort of more classic forecasting. Then that's the technique. So that's great. That's really nice to have techniques, but what variables do you put in it? And I think this is the part where a lot of people kind of stumble is this idea of, how do I know what explanatory variables do I put on the right-hand side of my model, and how do I craft those? So we talk about two kind of classes of explanatory variables: calendar-based, where they're variables based on day of the week and month and season, and then weather-based explanatory variables. How do I take my weather data, my temperatures, my humidity, cloud cover, or solar radiance, wind speed, whatever it is, and convert that raw data into something that works as an explanatory variable in our models? So we kind of walk through that, and then we end up with sort of alternative model specifications. Now, the book has, at the back end, there's a chapter dedicated to how do you handle the problem of incorporating behind-the-meter solar PV into a short-term load forecasting model. We'll enhance that chapter. We just completed a study for the California Energy Commission, which goes a much deeper dive on how to do that, but we will eventually start incorporating or updating that chapter. But for now, everything in terms of just pure load forecasting, it's there. There is a high-level description of how to handle the solar piece. All right, so the first thing we always start with, unlike if you think about a lot of academic journals or a lot of journals or papers that you read, they kind of start with the technique, and not as much attention is paid to the data. Well, we do kind of flip. In our world, we always start with the data. And the reason why we do that is by looking at the data, you start building up an idea of what set of explanatory variables do you want to put in your model. It also kind of gives you insight as to what technique you might use. If it's a flat industrial load, it may be that all you really need is something like a rotation algorithm or a similar day lookup. You may not need a regression or neural network. So looking at the data is sort of tantamount to understanding how you're going to go about forecasting that load. And there's several kind of looks that we use. The obvious ones are tabular views, so you just look at the raw data. You can look at summaries. These are summaries. So, kind of the things that we kind of focus on is right out of the gate would be the average. How big is this load? Is it 10,000 gigawatt hours? Is it 5 kW? That gives us insight as to whether or not, maybe I'm just modeling an individual residential home and it's only a 2 kW load. That might tell me what I should do differently than if I, say, was modeling, the aggregate load for the United States. So looking at averages and max and mins and load factors, load factors start giving you sort of a feel for how much the loads move around the mean. Those are sort of things you can glean from the tables. Now, the next thing we would do is we'd look at graphs. And honestly, graphs are sort of way more visually informative than any table ever would be. This is what we would call all data view. So basically, whatever historical load data I have that's available to me to model, I'm just going to graph it all the way out. Things that I'm looking for. One, are there shifts in the data? So a lot of times when we get data, it might be way lower at the beginning of the data set, and way higher at the end of the day, so or vice versa. Or midstream, you might see a drop off in the loads. Now, some of that is real. So, like for example, if there was a new, say, Walmart that came online, a 50 megawatt load, you would see a shift up in the load data. And then you have to ask yourself, well, is the older data, pre-Walmart, is that useful to include in my model estimation, or do I want to ignore it? Or do I need to construct explanatory variables to account for that shift? Other types of shifts are things that have to do with how loads are defined. Now, loads aren't really a sum of meters in most cases. What they are is sort of a mathematical um, equation which says, here's all the generation units, what they're pushing into the grid. Here's what's flowing out of the grid to maybe some nearby system. And so when I look at the net, what flows into the system less what's flowing out, I call that load. Well, sometimes, the definitions of like a new generation unit comes in, and whoever was responsible for going into the SCADA system and defining loads do the math wrong, and so you'll see this unusual drop in loads. So those are the kind of things we're looking for. The other thing we're going to look for are trends. Is the load growing slowly over time, upwards or downwards? Those are the kind of things we need to start asking ourselves, because all of that starts, one, making us make decisions about what data do we want to estimate over, all of it or just maybe the most recent. Do we have to put in variables to account for sort of unexpected shifts up or down? And then do we also have to add variables that account for the trends? So right out of the gate, just by looking at the data, we're already starting to, in our minds, start thinking about what variables we need. The other thing, and is what this kind of data shows you, is there's clearly seasonality to this load. Now, some of that is just operational, but a lot of this is going to be weather. And so we have to start thinking about, when we're building variables in these particular cases, we're going to want to have variables that are wrapped around at least temperatures. So that's all data. Then we drop into month views. And what we do here is we're comparing sort of a winter month to a summer month. If you're, in Australia, obviously the thing would be flipped. But what we're really looking for is, do we see the kind of classic double hump in the winter months? So the double hump meaning there's sort of a morning peak, and then the loads kind of drop down, and then that's followed by an evening peak. That's sort of the double hump, as opposed to in the summer months where you see this nice smooth shape that grows throughout the day and then kind of smoothly cascades down. What this tells us is this is sort of winter. The winter is sort of driven by space heating loads and lighting loads in the evening. But in the summer, you have a big base load of air conditioning that's kind of making the single hump. Again, pointing to, we need to worry about the weather sensitivity of these loads and how we're going to go about modeling it. That's month views. Here's month views for the other system we looked at. And then here's kind of the core weather sensitivity graph that we look at. It's a scatter plot. And it just simply, in this case, it's on the vertical axis, the sort of average load or daily load against temperature, which is on the horizontal. And what this says is as temperatures vary, our energy goes up or down, depending on where we're at. What we notice is that relationship between energy and temperatures is nonlinear. And that's at the core of almost all power forecasting, is that we have this nonlinear response between loads and temperatures. And most of the techniques and a lot of the literature is written about, are there different sort of statistical methods or frameworks that can handle this nonlinearity? Now, there are. Certainly neural networks fit perfectly for this, and it has to do with the mathematics of the neural networks. But there's also explanatory variables that we can construct and include in, say, a regression framework that can handle this nonlinearity just as well. So knowing that we've got this nonlinear weather response, obviously it's also sort of different, right? It's flatter on the heating side, so when temperatures get cold, even though loads go up, they don't go up at the same rate as on the space air conditioning side. When temperatures get hot, loads really zoom up. So there's that sort of nonlinearity. And then the separation between the blue dots and the green dots, well, the blue dots are weekdays and the green dots are weekends. So that also kind of tells us that, on average, the weather response is different between weekdays and weekends. So all this information just that we glean from looking at the data starts telling us that, one, we need some type of variable, that's a function of temperature at least, that will allow for a nonlinear response, and there are several ways we could do that. And then we'd also want to allow that weather response to be different between weekdays and weekends. And that's another that'll represent what we call an interaction term. So those are things we start gleaning as we look at scatter plots. All right, now what about data cleaning? So almost all the techniques we look at some point or another, look at finding parameter values that minimize the sum of squared errors. A data outlier is going to lead to a big error. If you square it, it's going to lead to a really big error. And even if you did sport vector regression, where you're sort of trying to tampen or dampen the effect of outliers, they still have an impact. So the best thing you can do is try to clean out or get rid of any data outliers that are in your data. And we talk about various approaches to doing that. And they go from simple things like just replace a number with a better number. Type in a number. You could average the 2 shoulder hours. Or to essentially just taking that day, that observation, and removing it completely from your estimation. So it has no impact whatsoever. So there's lots of different ways to correct for erroneous data. We also talk about validation tests. So not only your visual, although visual is definitely really great for identifying data outliers, but then there's some formal tests you can do in terms of simple things like max and min values, spike detection, and that kind of stuff that you can apply to the data and have the algorithms themselves catch the outliers. So that's sort of a key part to it. You look at your data, you cleaned up your data, all that stuff is like the setup. That's the stage for what's going to be the next step, which is the modeling part. All right. So what do? How do we now take this historical time series and project it forward? That's the problem. That's our task, right? We're trying to forecast where loads are going to be over the next 5 minutes, hour, 10 days. So there's 3 types of approaches that we talk about in the book. The first one is forecast algorithms. So of those, the top 2, like day or similar day lookup, and then rotation algorithms, arguably are one of the most pervasive ways of doing load forecasting that exists still today. The first one, similar day or like day, essentially what you're saying is if I'm forecasting tomorrow, and tomorrow is say a Wednesday in January, probably my best guess is to look at Wednesdays and Januaries from prior years and maybe even from last week, make an adjustment to those historical days, adjusting for what I think the weather is going to be like tomorrow, and paste that down and say that's my forecast for tomorrow. And there's lots of different ways you could select historical days. And there's also lots of ways you could take, if you got more than one historical day, how I could weight them together to create my forecast for tomorrow. So the similar day algorithms are not unusual for us when we put in automated forecasting systems to have been the algorithm that we're replacing. There is a tremendous amount of information in those algorithms. They're typically run by people, forecast experts who've been around for a long time. They have a deep, deep knowledge of what the loads are and what drives those loads. Being able to work with the forecast analysts that were there and help them migrate from their similar day algorithms and take all that information that they had garnered and embed that somehow in a statistical approach is, if you can make that happen, that's awesome. That would be the best of all worlds. And we tried very hard to do that whenever we are brought in to help replace an existing algorithm. Rotation algorithms are pretty straightforward. They simply say, you know what, take whatever happened last week, rotate it onto the current calendar, there's my forecast. Or take the same week from last year, rotate it forward, and there's my forecast. So that's a much more simpler approach. Typically works really well for large industrial or relatively stable industrial or mining loads, or potentially even agriculture loads. You can just rotate what happened last week and call it done. Now, we kind of compare and contrast those sort of historically implemented algorithms of similar day lookup and rotation to sort of something that comes from the machine learning world, which is decision tree regression. And in effect, decision tree regression does a lot of what a similar day lookup does. We kind of sort of segment our data based on either day of the week or day of the week and temperature. And then once we sort of segmented the data, we sort of take whatever we got left in terms of the historical data, average that. That's the regression piece. Average the data we found, and we say, bam, that average is what we're going to forecast with. But knowing how to segment your data, whether you segment by weekdays versus weekends or Mondays versus Fridays, and whether you're segmenting between hot days versus cold days, that knowledge is rooted in your similar day algorithm. The decision tree just takes that knowledge and implements it easier in terms of an sort of computer algorithm. But at the core, you need to have that sort of deep knowledge about how loads vary and what circumstances you want to segment your data on. Now, the other thing that decision tree regression does is it introduces a objective function. And in this case, the objective function is used to determine how to segment or split the historical data. So that introduces, in the book, we introduce this objective function as sort of, okay, now all the algorithms that we're going to talk about from this point forward have at its core some type of objective function. And this is the first one that we evaluate. Then we kind of slide over from these sort of algorithms to univariate frameworks. In univariate frameworks, the main thing is you're using your historical data to project forward. So you have this time series of load data, and you're simply, in a way, averaging it or something to predict going forward. Now, when you do that, you introduce things like lag structures, and you introduce how many equations. Is it a one equation thing or a multiple equation thing? And then there's various techniques, moving average, exponential smoothing, and ARIMA. Now, in terms of lag structures, if you've got historical load data flowing in, if you know how frequently that data is going to flow in. So if I'm doing forecasts at noon today for tomorrow, you have to ask yourself a critical question, and that question is, at noon today, what historical data do I have? Do I have what the loads were at 11 this morning, 10 this morning, 9 this morning, or all I have at noon today is what the loads were yesterday? So knowing what is available in terms of actual load data at the time you do a forecast is a critical bit of information. That then sets up what type of lag structures you could rely on. If at noon I have what the loads were at 11, I could do sort of a cross time or a cross hour sort of lag structures. I could say my forecast for 1 a.m. or 1 p.m. is a function of what the loads were at 11 and 10 and 9. If all I have is what happened yesterday, then I have a cross-day lag structure. So my forecast for 1 p.m. is a function of what the loads were yesterday at 1 p.m. So that's a different kind of lag structure. And then obviously the combination of both offers up a third lag structure. Which one you use totally depends on what data is available to you at the time you're doing the forecast. It also depends on what your forecast horizon is. So for example, if I'm forecasting 1 hour ahead, knowing what loads were that prior hour is very powerful. But if I'm forecasting 10 years from now, knowing what happened at 11 a.m., it's not going to be very powerful. So you have to kind of put in context as to what the forecast horizon is and how far is that horizon relative to the last bit of real information that you have available to you. So that's all discussed. Another thing that we describe in the book is this. There's always this sort of this outstanding question we get is, why do you do everything with, if I have hourly data, why do you do 24 equations? Why not just do one equation? And we kind of talk about what the pros and cons are of that. It's not that you couldn't use one equation, you certainly could, but the relationship of loads at 8 o'clock in the morning relative to loads at 7 o'clock in the morning, that relationship, where 8 o'clock usually is higher than 7 o'clock in the morning, is different than the relationship between loads at 8 p.m. relative to 7 p.m., where 8 p.m. tends to be a little bit lower. So that fundamental relationship, the slopes between 7 a.m. to 8 a.m. versus 7 p.m. to 8 p.m. are of different signs. So in order to have a single equation work, you need to allow for those slopes to be different. And that's where you start building a single equation with lots of hourly or sub-hourly offsets, binary offsets. And so now all of a sudden you've got one equation that may have hundreds of variables, which are nothing more than just binary offsets to allow the slopes to be different. You know, the weather response is probably different at 8 a.m. than it is at 8 p.m. Okay, well then I need to interact the weather with my hourly binaries. So it turns out that if you had hourly data, building 24 separate equations will do better or cannot do worse than one equation with all the hourly interactions. Because in essence, the one equation with all the hourly interactions is a constrained version of 24 separate equations. And that's sort of the argument that's made in the book to really look at this problem more from the perspective of doing hourly equations or sub-hourly equations versus just one equation. All right, then we get into the techniques. So we talk about moving average, which I think everyone's familiar, just a straight moving average or a weighted moving average. And then we get into sort of the classics, the exponential smoothing and arena models. And we talk about what the objective functions are, and we actually walk through examples of how the math works for all these techniques. And the intent is to try to show how lag loads can impact your forecasts of the future, but also how that information effectively starts decaying the further out you go into the forecast horizon. And that's sort of the key thing. We can build a lot of models, and I see this often where people always add to their models sort of autoregressive terms or these lag load terms, and they get awesome in-sample fits, but they're horrible for forecasts, especially for forecast horizons of 1 day plus. And the reason for that is when you start introducing autoregressive terms, in a way you're taking explanatory weight away from the other variables you have in your model. But the information that's embedded in those autoregressive terms has a decay, right? It's not perfect information, and in fact that information has less and less and less and less and less value the further out you go into the forecast horizon. I mean, clearly if you went 10 years out, what happened an hour ago is really almost useless. And so somewhere between 10 years out and 1 hour out is the crossover point where that information is not as useful as, say, having a good weather forecast for tomorrow. So we talk about that in the book as well. All right, then we kind of get to probably the thing that most people are going to be interested in, which is the multivariate framework. So that's your regression, the neural networks, and support vector regression. And what we try to do is introduce in detail the objective functions and how the parameters are estimated given that objective function and what that means. And then what we try to do is compare and contrast the functional forms. So the neural network has built into it already a mathematical functional form that handles nonlinearities. To do the equivalent in a linear regression, you have to construct explanatory variables that also give you that nonlinearity. And we speak to how you can handle it, and there's the different functional forms. And then we kind of end up the discussion with support vector regression, which is sort of a constrained version of the problem. And it imposes a constraint, and not in necessarily a bad way, but it's something to be aware of, that in cases, say, like if I had a large industrial load that's running flat all the time, except for on occasion at random points there's a down spike due to a random outage or something like that, those down spikes, if we don't remove them from our historical data, will bias our either regression or neural network estimated coefficients. Support vector regression imposes some structure to have those down spikes have less of an impact. And so it would, in effect, give us a more stable forecast in that case if we don't remove those down spikes from the history. So we talk about where support vector regression versus standard regression versus neural networks, what's behind them, what do they look like, what's the math behind them. Because understanding the math, and I know this is a big get, but understanding the math goes a long ways to understanding why I have to construct the variables I do that I include into my models. So that's all handled in this section here. And we go into quite a bit of detail about how the regression coefficients are estimated, etc. All right, that's all technique. Academic, or if you read journals, almost the vast majority of a journal paper will be oriented towards technique. What we really need to focus on is the data and the explanatory variables. The techniques are almost you need to understand how the techniques work and what makes the sort of how outliers impact the technique in terms of the estimated coefficients. But what's most important is understanding the data and then what explanatory variables you put in your model. And so, as I said, we kind of talk about two sets of explanatory variables. There's calendar-based variables, day of the week, months, seasons, holidays, time trends, things that are really move loads independently of weather. And then we spend a lot of time talking about weather-based explanatory variables. So we talk about bin approaches and polynomials and splines and neural network nodes and how all those things work in a model and how you get different estimated functional forms depending on which of those approaches you use. And we introduce all of that, and then you can introduce lag loads on top of all of it. So your models sort of break down into sort of calendar-based variables that impact the intercept, shift the loads up or down depending on the day of the week or the season or holidays. And then variables that are weather dependent, so how loads move, like that scatter plot relative to weather. And then at the end, you would then introduce any sort of lag terms if you're doing very short-term forecasts. So we kind of walk through all of that, what the variables are, and then there's a section that's sort of dedicated to, I guess this is the recipe of the recipe book. It introduces everything from a very simple model specification to a more complex model specification with one ginormous caveat. That still probably won't, that will get you 90% of the way. The last 10% of the way will be using explanatory variables that are dependent on your particular load situation. And your load situation will be different than the next person's load situation. So you can get there very quickly, 90% of the way, but that last 10%, that takes a lot of hard work and requires focusing on very specific days or periods of time in your load history and trying different explanatory variables to try to improve that particular period of time. So for example, you may have a full-blown extended day type with, temperature splines, the whole, or even neural network, but it's not hitting your peak days. And you would focus on just those peak days and what was it about the weather leading into that peak day that your base equations just aren't capturing. Do I need to sort of add in some cumulative effect? Do I need to interact my temperatures with humidity? Do I need to worry about where cloud cover was and wind speed? All those factors start coming into play, but it makes it much easier to build those models if you're focused on a particular day or a particular week, rather than trying to look at 2 to 3 years worth of data and go, oh, I don't know what to do. It's so much easier to focus on a very specific couple days or weeks. So that gets you the other 10%. So the first 90%, really the book essentially gives it to you. It's the next 10% that requires kind of a detailed understanding of your loads. All right, and then we sort of end up the book with sort of an overview. It's not intended to be a complete thing. If you are interested in this topic, we have completed 2 studies for the California Energy Commission. The reports are available. I can certainly point you to those reports. So if you want a deep dive on how to handle incorporating behind-the-meter solar PV generation into your load forecast, I can certainly point you to some reports on that. But the book does talk about sort of the overall idea and introduces sort of the kind of common approaches of either error correction or reconstituted load or modeling direct. You know, my personal preference is a more model direct approach. That's where you put the solar PV in the right-hand side of your model. It's an additional explanatory variable. The question is, does that have to get interacted with lots of things? And sort of what we're finding, the most recent studies that we're doing, is that the perceived effect of solar PV varies depending on the day of the week and what the prevailing weather conditions are outside. So it's not quite as easy as we thought when we first took a look at this problem 7 years ago. It certainly has evolved, and our thoughts about how to handle this have evolved. So if you do want some more information about that, I'd be happy to provide that to you. But there is at least the beginning elements of this problem, and how to go about handling this problem is in the back of the book. And we'll probably revise this chapter over time. All right, so if all of that sounds interesting and you would like to get a copy of the book, if you go to our website or our part of the ITRON website, so www.itron.com/forecasting, and right in the middle of the page, you'll see a Practitioner's Guide to Short-Term Load Forecasting. Click on Read More. That'll give you a form. You fill out your form with your name and email address, and then you'll be able to download the book in PDF format, and you have at it. You know, enjoy it. I hope you get a lot of benefit. I hope you can glean something from it that is worth your while. Now, for those who may not realize, we actually have a lot of topics that we cover on our website. There's a blog section. I encourage all of you to go check out the blog. There's always some topic out there you might find of interest. And if there's a blog topic you would like us to address, feel free to send us an email at metricsnd@itron.com, or you can email me direct, and we'll be happy to write a blog on that topic. So that's the forecasting blogs. Tons of them out there. And then upcoming events. There's Energy Forecasting 101, which really is oriented to sort of long-term forecasting, sort of monthly sales forecasting. It's great for someone new to forecasting and want to get, sort of boned up on, the techniques and the language of forecasting. We also have a class on SAE, which is the statistically adjusted approach to end-use forecasting, which allows you to, when you do your long-term forecast, to account for things like light bulb efficiency trends or EV charging saturations or potentially even PV saturations. So that's the SAE, Introduction to SAE. There's an advanced forecast topics workshop that'll be held in Boston. That's also part of all of those two. The SAE and advanced forecast topics are in conjunction with the annual energy forecasting meeting, which is in Boston. The EFG is really focuses on long-term forecasting from the utility perspective. So it will have things like where is national standards for appliance standards and equipment, what's going on with EV charging and its penetration, solar PV generation and its penetration, storage, all those demand response, all the time of use rates. So all the things that can impact not only the energy but the load shapes, long-term load shapes of a utility. That's all addressed in the EFG meeting. In May, we also have our annual forecasting summit for the ISO folks. So, this is the ERCOTs, the Cal ISO, the MISOs, the PGMs, the New York ISO New England, the Albertas, and the independent system operators in Canada, and as well as in Australia. All the forecasters get together and talk about both operational as well as long-term forecasting as it impacts from the perspective of a ISO. We will be doing European user meeting, and there's the ITRON Utility Week, which is later in the year in Florida, and we'll be making announcements about what we're going to do there. Now, brown bag seminars that are coming up. So as you know, we usually roll about 4 of these a year. So the first one that's coming up is in February. It's going to be leveraging a waterfall approach to long-term forecasting. So Andy is going to be doing this. And really what this does is if you do a long-term forecast, it allows you to peel out how much of that load change is due to population growth, economic drivers, energy efficiency, demand response, EV charging penetration, storage penetration, solar PV penetration, and allows you to, through the course of the waterfall, each waterfall step, it gives you the impact, the load and energy impact of each of those technologies. And Andy will go into quite a bit of detail about how we do that. Then we're going to be doing a topic on how you can use your AMI data to improve your sort of financial forecasting. So your month-end close, budget versus your budget, your variance analysis, budget versus actual. How you can leverage the AMI data to give you quicker results and more visibility to where you are within a month, rather than having to wait till after the month to understand what's happening. And then Mark will be doing a forecast actually benchmark survey and energy trends. I think this is going to be about the 6th or 7th year that we've done this survey and provided those results. If you attend the energy forecasting meeting in April, you'll be actually get to see the current results. And then we're going to finish up the year. I'll do a very detailed look at that, incorporating solar PV into your statistical models and sort of our latest thinking about what those specifications need to be in order to really handle that correctly. So that's all the stuff that's coming up, kind of a full agenda. And we'll stop at that point, and I'll open it up for questions.
Frank, there's one question already. How useful is the book for long-term forecasts?
So the orientation is to short-term, but the discussion on sort of how a regression, sort of the regression model specification, the objective function, how the parameters are solved, I mean, that's completely applicable to long-term because it's the same technique. And then there is a lot of variables, all a bit, somewhat more oriented towards hourly or sub-hourly in terms of explanatory variables. But there is a treatment about how to handle weather, splines, which is kind of a classic approach that's used for long-term forecasting, but it also kind of talks about how polynomials could be used. So there's quite a bit of the explanatory variables could be used in a long-term forecast. Now, granted, you don't have daily values, you may only have monthly values, but that sort of same sort of model spec can be applied to monthly. So quite a bit of overlap.
Excellent. And we don't have it listed on our event schedule yet because we don't have the dates for it, but how does the information that you're presenting in this book tie into the short-term forecasting workshop?
Yeah, and thank you for that, because what I'm not listing is we do have a short-term forecasting workshop. It'll be in September in San Diego. The goal this year is to use the data and use the book essentially to drive that course. So that way, when you're done with the workshop, you can take the data, and you obviously will have a copy of the book, and you can continue to work with that data and practice using what you've got out of the workshop. So it's very much hand in hand. The book is sort of tailored for the workshop, and the workshop's going to be tailored for the book. So thank you for that question.
And they would contact you if they have any other questions about the book?
Yeah, feel free. You can always reach me at frank.monforti@itron.com. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Or you can send it to forecasting@itron.com as well, and we'll get it to Frank. There's another question. Is the variation of coefficients in hourly models from what? Wait, I missed that one here. Let me go back here. In your experience, might school holiday schedules be a meaningful explanatory variable?
Good question. Absolutely. In particular, we see this. It's kind of interesting in the little side story. The models that we build for the Australian market operator have the school holidays embedded in them, and it's because most of the country follows the same schedule, and that schedule is year round. So it makes a big difference when the kids are in school versus not in school. So yes, we in fact we break it down between sort of a winter schedule, a spring schedule, summer and fall schedule, because because you're in different parts of the year with different weather, the coefficients on those will vary depending on which part of the year. So that's how we take sort of the school holiday and play it out. Now, when you do that, it's simple like binaries. It takes on a value 1 if it's the winter school holiday, as long as it's not on the weekend. So or a normal kind of national holiday. So it's a pretty straightforward variable or variables to set up, but yes, it can have quite a bit of impact on your load forecast.
This one I am going to unmute Mark Taylor here.
Okay.
Hey, Frank. This is Arthur.
Hi, Mark.
Oh, it's Arthur.
Oh, hi, Arthur.
Hi. I'm just in the room. We're all in the same room. So, Frank, back to the hourly interval model approach.
Mm-hmm.
And, we model the intervals very often, hours very close to one another, have almost always virtually all the same variables. And as you go from one interval to the next, each of the parameters or the coefficients on those variables, they'll start to change slightly from, 1 hour to the next. But they really are independent equations, and that least squares process for each hour is independent of the next. And so sometimes when you compare, say, the weather coefficient, they're not always smoothly moving from 1 hour to the next. They tend to get, especially with smaller intervals, they tend to vary. And so I'm wondering, is there any way around that? Is there some kind of panel approach that you can somehow constrain the weather coefficient so they understand that the weather response from 1 hour is similar to the weather response in the next hour, and they don't move around quite so much as we often find?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of ways to do it. And one would be a panel approach where you do have that. But another way to do it is you have a higher level set of models. Let's say you're modeling 15-minute data. You could have a higher set of models that are, maybe nighttime, morning, afternoon, evening, and you get the weather response from the higher level models, and you simply impose that weather response on the appropriate 15-minute intervals. In fact, that's one way or a way you can handle the behind-the-meter solar, right? The higher level models, you can get a strong and meaningful coefficient on the solar variables from the high level models, and then just simply impose that either in like a reconstituted load approach or something like that on the 15-minute or sub-hourly ones. And that way you kind of control the weather response across the hours with your higher level model. So that's a simpler way to do it. A panel would be certainly another way of doing it.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Arthur. There's another question. What could be an example of bias that may present under multivariate frameworks?
Example of bias? Well, so here's the thing. No matter how we look at it, our models, and this is sort of independent technique. This is true whether you use machine learning or kind of classic regression neural networks. At the end of the day, what are we trying to do? We're trying to represent what we feel is average behavior. Now, in reality, if we were to sort of model the loads for any system, The ideal world would be we'd go to each house or to each building or each facility, and we would say, okay, when do you open the refrigerator door? When do you close it? When are you going to turn on that light switch? When are you going to close it? And we would do this extremely detailed, bottom-up roll of all the equipment that's being used in that uh, system. The reality is we can't do that. We'll never know all the refrigerators. We're never going to know when they're open and when they're closed. Same thing with lights. Same thing with industrial processes. But what we hope for, and this is sort of the kind of, if you're a large system, your MAPES or your sort of precision appears to be much better than, say, the precision of a large system. Really what's happening is the law of large numbers is working in your favor. But even in a large system, we make errors. Now, are those errors, are they sort of consistent? In principle, what we try to do when we're adding our explanatory variables, we try to eliminate any consistent bias either above or below. You know, we know our models are going to be biased. They may be biased high, they may be biased low, but on any given week, you may see a stream of either over forecasting or under forecasting. And what we want to do is redesign or add explanatory variables to eliminate any sort of run in the bias. So at the end, yes, we want unbiased forecasts, but more importantly, what we want to do is during hot periods, we don't want our forecast to always be under, or during cold periods, we don't want the forecast to be always over. So we try to the best we can, we're trying to build variables. So yes, there may be days we're wrong, and in fact, every day we'll be wrong. We just have to accept that. But what we don't want to do is be wrong all the time in the same direction. If we're always wrong in the same direction all the time, then we can add a variable, some type of variable, to correct for that. And so that's really what we're looking for. We're trying to avoid consistent runs in either over or under forecasting.
Thank you. There is another question about where on our webpage you would find and download the paper. So I think I'm sharing my web browser for the energy forecasting page, and so I just wanted to help everybody find where we're at. So you would click on this read more kind of thing here,
and then you can, Practitioner's Guide. Yeah.
Right. And then you can click on download the guide, and then they'll ask for some information on who you are and, you know, just some contact information. I'm going to stop sharing that right now and see if there are other questions. Is there a similar book or guide for long range 1 to 10 years for forecasting?
No, not yet. I mean, we haven't written that yet, but there is information in this guide that can be used for long range or 1 year or longer forecasting. The kind of the trick, it's not so much the technique. Regression can work great. The trick is when you're doing long term, then you have to kind of focus on things like economic trends. You know, like, so is the economy growing or not growing? Is population growing, not growing? Those, and you need to get those type of variables into your models. The short-term models, if you really look at them, don't really have much in the way in terms of, say, like GDP or employment or anything like that. You don't really typically see those in the short-term forecast, but in the long run, you certainly need those. And then the other part to all of that, and this is where our statistically adjusted end-use framework is what it's really designed to capture is, and not only the lighting loads, by the way, the lights are going to become more efficient over time, and we need to have some way of trending sort of the sales data downwards to account for those efficiency trends, while at the same time, you may have upward trends in sales attributed to things like EV, electric vehicle charging. So when you start doing long-term forecasting, the technique, the regression technique, same as short-term, but the set of explanatory variables change.
Okay, and then how do you forecast the distribution of the load of each hour rather than the averages only?
So what we do is there's a couple ways. I mean, one of the statistics that comes with any of the techniques is a model standard error. So sort of the classic is you take the model standard error plus or minus, 1.96, whatever, and that gives you sort of a variation. What we find more useful, however, is to capture the let's say we capture the sequence of day-ahead forecasts, and we look at the sequence of day-ahead forecast errors, and we have those by hour or by sub-hour. What we do is we model those forecast errors. So we have a separate set of models, and those models, again, are going to be functions of things like some type of calendar will be a function of what the weather was, and we model the forecast errors themselves, and then we use those models, and there's sort of a fancy term for this. It's called generalized autoregressive conditional heteroscedasticity. So that's sort of the approach we use, but we modeled the actual forecast errors to give us upper and lower bounds that are realistic in terms of what has happened in terms of forecast errors in the past. And then we can predict that with forecasted weather, etc. And you can extend that idea. You could do, if you had captured the day-ahead weather forecast and compute the day-ahead weather forecast errors, you could model that as well. And maybe that's more of an autoregressive model or something along, or maybe it's seasonal. But you could model those errors as well and then drive those through those sort of upper and lower bounds if you want. You could drive those upper and lower bounds on the weather forecast errors back through your load forecast load forecast model in order to drive new upper and lower bounds on your load forecast. So there's a number of techniques. Other things that we do, it's sort of a classic. We'll use multiple weather service providers and we'll use the same load forecast model, but with alternative weather forecasts. And a lot of the commercial vendors will have, upwards of, 10 to 20 alternative weather patterns, streams, that come from the higher level models, and you could push all 20 or so of those weather forecasts through your load forecast models to get a sort of a range of load forecasts associated with weather forecast uncertainty.
And have you found the errors of hourly load non-normal?
Yes. In fact, yes. It's asymmetric for sure. So they're non-normal. They're biased around zero. But if you look at sort of weather, if you're looking at, let me be careful. We have to be different. We have to be very careful that we're not talking about in-sample fit error distributions versus, say, day-ahead forecast error distributions. So if you're looking at those, that in both cases, they're assuming normality is probably too strong. There's certainly asymmetry. So you want to be able to model or account for over forecast error distributions looking different than under forecast error distributions. Now, what those actually look like depends on your model and your weather forecast systems and all that stuff, but they are certainly, to go in there and assume normality is probably too strong of an assumption.
And I think that's it. If anybody has any other questions, please just either email Frank directly or just forecasting@itron.com. And do you have any last words, Frank?
No, I appreciate your time. I'm hoping if you download the book, you get 1, 2, or 3 new ideas that you hadn't had before. That'd be a huge success. So I hope everyone has a great year, and I hope the book you find is of use to you. Have a good day.